In interest of time, I'll make a start, and just moving into the presentation itself, we would like to first of all acknowledge the support by the Department of Education, Skills and Employment, who are our supporter of the market research we undertake, the annual market survey and this quarterly market insights initiative. And we do special thanks to the department for their ongoing support for this really valuable data for the English language sector. I'd also like to acknowledge Bonnard, and Svetlana will present. I'm sure many of you have worked with Svetlana, is part of the data collection process, and her team. Wonderful supporters of the research and great colleagues. It's part of all of our English Australia research projects. And lastly, just to thank Allianz Global Assistance for their ongoing support for our market intelligence series as well. Thanks to Allianz. We do want to start today's presentation and set a little bit of the context before we jump straight into the actual Q1 results from the survey. So we thought what would be useful is if we provide a short few slides updating on the 2021 student visa performance, and that'll look at the commencements and enrolments data for the experience for the sector year to date, and follow that up with the results from the Q1 survey, looking at that and breaking it down on state and provider type analysis. We'll provide an update on some of the unique findings, particularly related to the employee impact, which is measured through the survey. But then, because we've also more recently had the April 2021 student commencement and enrolment data released for student visa only, we'll give a quick update on that data too. At the end of this presentation, we will just note that the next survey round will also open shortly. And within the next survey process, when we do the webinar for Q2, will be aligned with the release of the Department of Education, Skills and Employment student visa only data. So jumping straight into the March 2021 performance. And if we look back at March this year, we'll recall that through 2020 itself, comparing to March 2020, we've still had borders open for the majority of March 2020. And the border closure that we saw on the 19th of March 2020 meant that a number of student cohorts had actually already arrived into Australia, and the trend was still relatively positive compared to 2019. The April data will show an even more significant impact as a result of the border closures. But here, looking at that period for March up to the end of March 2020 versus March 2021, in the enrolments, you can see from ELICOS, we were already down in our enrolment pattern, predominantly because of the Chinese students enrolments that hadn't returned. And ELICOS, as at March 2020, had already seen a decline, quite a significant decline of 65% in that enrolment cohort. The commencement figure wasn't quite as significant when we looked at what was happening in the commencement figure. It was just lower at 65.8%, but marginal when you really consider that overall performance, the year-to-date performance compared enrolment and commencements. But I think this was really the start of last year, where we saw 2020 being okay. So when we fast forward to 2021, the decline is significant. So that 65% decline in both enrolments and commencements, and largely, much more in that period than what we've seen across the other sectors. Even in the commencing cohorts, higher education was down 21%. We had the vet sector only down at that stage by 9.5%. Schools were down 51%, but the non-award, traditionally largely tied to our English students, those foundation programs, but also study abroad, was down almost 80% at 79% decline. When we look at that in terms of a breakdown via the different jurisdictions, and you'll see on the next slide, we've given some data on that pattern. Sorry, first of all, on the pattern, the decline from in 2021 versus January 2020, that pattern of just over 60% had continued on, but the year-on-year comparison has started to drop a little bit because, again, January 2020, borders still open. February 2020, borders were still open. But by March, we'd had started to experience some of the decline in a few of the markets. I'll go now on to the next slide and looking at that then on a country breakdown. What you'll note is again, referring back to this time last year, a number of key source markets, particularly from Latin America, were doing well in Australia. And we saw in commencements in 2020, particularly out of Brazil and Colombia, tracking relatively strong up until the first quarter of last year. And those markets have now seen a very, very significant decline in the 2021 data. 70% in Colombia, 76% in Brazil. China still representing our largest source market overall. It experienced a decline year on year as at March, 56%. And you can go around and obviously note that across many of those key source markets, looking at the top 10, and we had the majority of declines were greater than 60% other than China, and up to the highest proportion of all, which was out of Spain at 88%. And yeah, a real drop, almost decimating the entire market out of Spain. On a state level, if we look at that breakdown, it's really sort of been a negative position all over the country. And what is masked a little bit here is where we see, particularly up in Queensland, the 70% decline in student commencements. That doesn't take into account, oops, Svetlana, your other videos, just jump back on. That doesn't take into account the non-student visa cohort out of Queensland, which typically made up almost half of the overall student numbers. So the 70% only represent the student visa cohort, and we'll just have there we are, back on screen. We'll jump now into the Q1 data, because I think we have looked at the 2021 March. We've presented that report previously. So let's jump into the market survey itself. And then, as I noted, at the end of the presentation, I'll come back and report back on the April 2021 data. So Svetlana, would you now like to...
Hi, Brett. Yes, I am facing some technical difficulties with my video so far. I'm not sure if...
Are you right to keep on going with the presentation?
Yes, I mean, if it's okay with without my video, I think it will be, I can move on with this. So hi everyone, and thank you, Brett, for providing us the March data for 2021. So diving into the quarterly ELICOS Market Insight Survey for Q1 2021. So just a quick overview of the scheme. So we actually started with this last year as a timely market performance, to provide timely market performance data on all students regardless of their visa status. So Brett was presenting the student visa data from DESE. So here we can actually provide all the student visa status for the whole student cohort. So of course, we also wanted to provide new areas and insights into every quarter. So an example for that is when we actually included the COVID-19 employees section last quarter in Q4 2020. So to shed light on how it was actually affected by the pandemic last year. So moving on to the research itself. So for Q1 2021, 98 colleges participated. And of course, we wanted to thank each and every one of you who actually took the time to submit your data, both for Q1 2020 and Q1 2021. So the research is based on a sample of 84 colleges, which provided the data for both quarters. And of this cohort, 12 providers reported no enrollments in Q1 2021, and 4 of them are currently on hibernation. So we can see here on the slides that New South Wales and Queensland are both strongly represented. So with New South Wales with 30 participating colleges, and with Queensland with 26 participating colleges. So for South Australia, we have 10 colleges, and Victoria with 20, and Western Australia with 12 colleges. For provider types, so we can see here that university and standalone colleges are tying in with the most representation in Q1 2021. So at 32 participating university-based colleges. This is followed by vocation and education training schools at 17, and with schools with 6 participants, followed by multisector with 5, and private higher education with 4. Looking at the Q1 2021 data itself. So Brett provided the year-to-date March student commencements for student visas. And for the quarterly scheme, we have, as I mentioned before, it covers all the visa types, regardless of any visas. And here we can see that for Q1 2021, there was a drop of 73.4% for student numbers and 72.9% with student weeks. So this is actually a bigger decrease if we compare it to the DESA data. So again, this is based on those 84 colleges that both reported both their Q1 2020 and Q1 2021 data. And so for Q1 2021, it's actually down to 5,552 students. With the visa breakdown, so looking at it, so naturally the students under student visa have the highest market share for the student numbers at 73%. And this is followed by other visas at 23%. And it's important to note that those offshore students who currently doesn't have any visas, or who are actually under visa, like with pending visa applications, were classified here by participating college. So hence the other visas are actually higher in share compared to, of course, with a visitor and working holiday. And this is reflected with the student weeks, with the student visas at 82% share, followed by other visas at 16%. Just a quick look at the students by booking source. So we can see here that the commissionable bookings are up to 87% for Q1 2020. And if we compare this to, comparing this to Q4 2020, which is actually down to 80%. So there's actually less direct bookings for Q1 2021 with students. With the instruction method, so majority of the students are still in online classes. Wherein like half of the student population are still currently on online classes, and followed by face-to-face at 43%. And 7% with blended learning. And this is actually reflected on the study location. So although the onshore students are actually 53%, because in Q4 2020, it was 50%. But we can still see here that offshore students are still a majority of the student population for Q1 2021. So 47% of them are studying offshore. And of course, there's still, you can see here that there's still a big cohort of students who are still interested to study despite the border closures in Australia. And in terms of comparing the research sample across the board, so the numbers that I'm actually currently showing are the data based on the 71 providers that participated throughout all quarters from Q1 2019. So they provided their data last year during the Q1 2020. So this is up to the Q1 2021 data. So when looking at the trend here, so you can see that the development on the core sample as it actually dropped to 76%. So from year to date March. And this shows how the like-to-like comparison on the overall decrease of students during this time frame. And as I mentioned before, the Q1 2021 data was down to 73% levels. But if we actually look at the core sample here, capturing all students under visa types, it's actually a much lower decrease at 76% during this time frame. And moving on to the state overviews. So all state experienced a decline of over 66% in student numbers. So we can see here with New South Wales as the most affected state. It actually faced the steepest decline in terms of quarter-on-quarter change and absolute numbers. So New South Wales is actually down to a 77.8% with 1,543 students. This is followed by Queensland, which is, it also experienced a decline of 77.7% in student numbers. So Queensland is now 898 students. In terms of quarter-on-quarter change, so South Australia experienced the smallest decline at 66.1%. And this is followed by Victoria. So in terms of student week numbers, Victoria saw the steepest decline at 59,159. And then Western Australia here is down to 72.7% in student weeks with 6,990 weeks for Q1 2021. And just an additional, as I mentioned before, so we tried to provide new insights for every quarter. So we added this section to the questionnaire. So it's the onshore and offshore tuition fee by state. And we can see here that there's actually a little variation in the average tuition fee for students studying onshore and offshore. And so with onshore, the average tuition fee is $333 per week. And for offshore, it's $332 Australian dollars, of course, per week. And moving on to New South Wales. So most of the top 10 source countries in this state experienced more than 70% dropped between Q1 2020 and Q1 2021, with the exception of China and Turkey. So China at 39% is down to 39%, and with Turkey at 60%. China is the top source market for New South Wales in Q1 2021 with 479 students. So we can say that it had the best performance among the top 10 source countries with only 39%. So in terms of absolute numbers, the state's traditional top source markets such as Japan, Brazil, Colombia, South Korea, and China actually experienced the largest decreases. So we can see here that Japan from 1,189 in Q1 2021, it was down to 216. So it experienced a drop of 82% or 973 less students. And looking at Brazil here with 986 students in Q1 2020, it is actually down to 128 in Q1 2021. So it has 858 less students in Q1 2021. And looking at, just to provide you a quick insight on Japan and Brazil, Japan's Q1 2020 data are actually like 58% of this are under visitor visa. So this actually explains the drop in student numbers during this quarter. And for Brazil, 79% of students in Q1 2020 are actually under student visa. So here we can tell that the majority of these students cohort are actually under these visa types. For Queensland, the top 10 source markets performances varied compared to New South Wales. So majority of the markets experienced a drop of more than 70%, while Colombia and India experienced a decline of 59% and 53% respectively. On the other hand, Turkey experienced an increase, but very minimal with 4 more students. And looking at source markets with the largest decreases in terms of absolute numbers, Japan, China, South Korea, Colombia, and Brazil are these markets. So all of these largest decreases in terms of source markets are also included in the top 10 source countries for Queensland. Again, if we look at Japan, because we can see here how much Japan dropped to 137 students. Looking at its Q1 2020 data, 54% of its students are under visitor visa. For South Australia's, the student market share heavily relies on China as the top source market with 317 students. And if we look closely with the type of visa of Chinese students in South Australia, so 52% of them are actually under other visa type. So as I mentioned before, other visa types are usually those offshore students who doesn't have any visa or actually have visa pending applications. So we can actually associate this as looking at South Australia. A majority of the students, 78% of them, are actually studying offshore. So that actually explains China's performance with the state. And in terms of year-on-year performance, Colombia experienced the largest drop at 81%. And in terms of absolute numbers, South Australia's largest decreases of source markets are from China, Japan, Brazil, Colombia, and Saudi Arabia. So that's the ranking for the largest decreases. And moving on to Victoria. So Victoria's top 10 source markets experienced more than 70% drop, with the exception of China and Indonesia. So with China, 41% decrease, and with Indonesia with 38%. Brazil have the biggest drop in terms of quarter-on-quarter performance at 90%. And so it's actually down to 16 students from 167 in Q1 2020. In terms of absolute numbers, the largest decrease was experienced by China with less than 563 students in Q1 2021 versus Q1 2020. However, despite this, China remains to be the top source market for Victoria. And China actually holds here in this 825 students, 86% of them are actually student visa holders. And for Victoria, 70% of its student population in Q1 2021 are actually offshore students. And lastly, for Western Australia, so this state actually had the most varying top 10 source country performance. So we have here Colombia with 42% as the top source market. And we have here Japan at 85% dropped for Q1 2021. And it actually had the largest decrease as well in terms of absolute numbers. So with 498 less students in Q1 2021. China, on the other hand, had the largest decrease in terms of absolute numbers with 356 less students. And due to this performance from China and Japan, Colombia rose as the top source market in Western Australia with, as I mentioned, with 42% decline in terms of quarter-on-quarter performance. As for the provider type analysis, so first you would go for the standalone ELICOS colleges, and here we can see that they are the most affected provider, both in absolute numbers and quarter-on-quarter performance. So standalone ELICOS colleges is down to 82% in terms of student numbers and in 80.6% in student weeks. For the standalone ELICOS colleges, its top 10 source market comes in varying regions. So we can see here with from the Americas region, Asia Pacific. And however, for Q1 2021, countries from the Americas region showed its importance for this provider type, with Colombia and Brazil as the top 2 source countries. So Colombia is down to 42%, however, and Brazil down to 61%. And in terms of absolute numbers, Japan experienced the largest decrease with 1,182 less students. So it actually dropped to 85%. So despite being second, Brazil also was the second market experiencing the largest decreases with 1,103 students. So Japan was the source market with the largest decrease, followed by Brazil. And looking at the quarter-on-quarter performance, South Korea actually fared the best among the top 10 source markets with only 17% decline. For universities, university-based colleges, on the other hand, fared off slightly better with a decrease of 65% in student numbers and a lower decrease at 57% with student weeks. So this is definitely a big difference if we compare it to standalone ELICOS colleges. And it is important to note that the performance of university-based colleges can be associated with the enrollments of offshore students, which is, so 86% of the market share of university-based colleges are actually enrolled as offshore students. And looking at their top 10 source markets, we can see here that university-based colleges rely on Asia-Pacific countries, most importantly, China, Japan, and South Korea. And despite the 42 decrease with China, university-based enjoyed actually the most enrollment from this country. So one at 1,498 students. So this is the largest cohort of Chinese students enrolled in this provider type. And in terms of absolute numbers, Japan had the largest decrease as well with 2,858 less students in Q1 2021. For vocation, education, and training schools, comparing it to standalone colleges, they still fared better with a 69.3 decline in student numbers and 79.0% with student weeks. So, however, we can see here that the student weeks actually had a steeper decline compared to its student numbers. So from 64,723 weeks, it is actually down to 13,585 weeks. For the top 10 source countries for the vocation education training schools, we can see here the importance of the Americas region for vet schools. However, there's actually a huge drop from Colombia and Brazil. So 67%, Colombia is down to 67%, and with Brazil down to 71%. And looking at this, both countries actually also had the largest decreases for vet providers in Q1 2021. So this is across all provider types, and Colombia and Brazil, despite being the top source countries for this provider type, they also experienced the largest decreases. And just a quick run through for the multi-sector schools and private higher education. So for multi-sector, from 468 students, unfortunately, it is down to Q1 2021 to 182 students. There was actually a decline of 61%. And with student weeks, we did student weeks at 63.7%. As for school-based colleges, it is down to 80.9%. So from 345 students, it is now 66 students for Q1 2021, while its student weeks had a bigger decline at 84% with 748 weeks. And lastly, for the private higher education, the student numbers are down to 79.5% with 58 students, and with student weeks at 79.7%. And moving on to the COVID-19 employee impact, I would like to give it back to Brett to discuss this, and back to you, Brett.
Yeah, thank you very much, Svetlana, and really do appreciate your ability to pull out some unique insights in terms of the reportable Q1 data. Just a reminder for all of the providers that participated in the survey, post today's webinar, we will circulate the report to you, as well as the pivot table for that data set to enable you to do your own independent analysis as well. As part of this survey over the recent periods, we've actually been asking colleges to report in on employee impact, and for the first time to be able to measure what impact the decline in student numbers has had on staffing levels. So when we look at that in terms of Q1 2021, this survey result is based on 63 colleges that actually were able to contribute data looking at the employee impact across staff and across different attributes of whether there were no changes in terms of the staffing ratios that they had at the start of the quarter, and noting that we are measuring the quarterly impact versus whether they've had to reduce staffing levels, utilise leave requirements, or whether that the role has been deceased altogether. Now, in this data set, I think it is also important to note that when we are surveying on the period of January to March, it still included the period of when the JobKeeper Employee Assistance Program was still operating. And so that has had an impact, certainly in terms of keeping some of the staffing numbers at a higher level than what we are experiencing, certainly year to date now at the mid-year point. But looking at the survey results for Q1, essentially it showed that of the population of staff that were employed at colleges across the all of the surveyed respondents, so around 35% of those were employed full-time, almost 20% that were part-time, and we had that seasonal, so casual employee workforce still maintaining the highest proportion of staff employed across the colleges. And so over 45% of staff were still being retained in that quarter largely on casual and seasonal contracts. Within that respondent group, I think it's probably fair to say that the assistance that was being utilised by colleges under particularly JobKeeper has impacted to the extent that we had around 58% of the total respondent group reporting that they had no change over that quarter, and that their staffing levels had remained consistent with what they were prior, and that's obviously what they were at the start of the year through to the end of the March position. When we look at those different cohorts, though, I think it is important to note, you know, even in that period where employee assistance was available, the size of those market downturns still weren't able to keep staffing levels, you know, obviously consistent. And overall, there were 22% of the staff at those colleges that reported as part of the survey have actually lost their jobs. And that's something that's, I think, quite a sobering number. You know, over 1 in 5 people were unable to be retaining their positions, even with the support packages that were in place. And looking at that, as I mentioned, the largest cohort of staff employed are generally seasonal. And within that, it was almost a relative proportion. So of those that lost their jobs, around 41% of that those people were actually employed on casual or seasonal contracts. So the proportion stayed pretty consistent. We again, it was sort of relatively proportional to the other visa categories as well. And overall, when we think about the other mechanisms that were used in terms of employee conditions, be it whether they've had the role ceasing, being required to utilise leave requirements and utilise leave periods during that period, or to reduce hours, it's around 42% of all college staff have had some impact in that quarter. And again, it's a really concerning number. And I think one of the greatest issues that our sector will face moving forward is the significant loss in the qualified teachers and administrators that unfortunately aren't able to be maintaining employment through this period. It'll be very interesting now that when we conduct the survey for Q2, which will be commencing shortly, to see what impact post-JobKeeper we've experienced across the sector in the period from April, May and June of this year. Moving on, what I would like to now look at is, as I framed up the start of the session today, we wanted to provide a bit of a backdrop against the March 2021 data on student visa commencements and enrolments, then lead into the presentation Svetlana's just provided on the Q1 results. And now, I guess, just giving a quick update on the 2021 April results. And in April, it's one of the, I think, points to note is we'd already started to see a decline in April 2020 versus April 2019. And that in itself was a decline of around 17, nearly 18% last year. And so if you backtrack, we were already 18% down come April 2020. And on the back of that, in April 2021, the sector has declined another 64% in absolute numbers. So combining, if you consider that combined performance, then we're actually, it's almost a 72% decline from where we were in 2019 to where we are today, or where we were, sorry, in April of this year. So again, it's useful now to start to frame that if we're looking year on year, we'd already had a commencement decline. Across the overall all sector data, as at April, all sectors were down almost 30%, so 29.8%. And just very quickly on the commencement figures, higher education down 21% in commencements, 12% in enrolments. We had the vet sector now down 9% in commencements and just over 1%, sorry, just over 0%, so 0.5% in enrolments. Schools down 52% in commencements and down 30% in their enrolments. But ELICOS here, as I mentioned, down 64% in April alone in commencements and 65% in enrolments. And only the non-award, which is a much smaller cohort, but the sector of non-award declined 78% in commencements and 65% in enrolments. I'll pick up some of the other data points when we have a look at the top 10 countries. So moving on here, in terms of our year-on-year performance, it's April in its own performance was just 61.5%. And if we measure that against where we were year to date, we've already pointed out that you can see back on 2019 data, April had been quite a significant enrolment period in the seasonal pattern, dropping in 2020 with a hard border closure and then another 61% decline in 2021. On individual nations perspective, here the top 3 countries, particularly if we look at China, Brazil and Colombia, were accounting for 43% of all of the student cohort. If I look at those numbers, even from where they were in 2020, those 3 countries in themselves equated to around 15,000 or 15,316 students in 2020. Of that 15,000, over 10,000 students declined from year on year. So we lost 10,089 students, and dropping the student numbers in those 3 top markets alone from 15,316 commencements down to only 522 commencements in this period. And the impact of that is I think shared when, as Svetlana pointed out in the earlier presentation, we've got the traditionally the university-based providers that had the largest market share out of China, but the private independent ELICOS and vet-based markets, which had many more students coming through out of the South American market. Now in 2021, they've seen enormous declines across the student numbers, as you can see on the screen, the overall picture out of those 3 alone, 58% in China, 69% in Colombia and 75% in Brazil. Interestingly, Nepal in April was in the top 4. And as we reported back in our recent webinar on the 2020 results, Nepal had increased last year from number 11 top source market to number 7 at the end of 2020. Well, as of April, Nepal, with just 1,171 enrolments, had actually jumped into the top 10 and now reported in at number 4 overall. Moving on in terms of a state-by-state perspective, you can see we've had, I guess, the issue with the declining period again, it's that we're actually seeing declines on top of the previous declines. In New South Wales, which experienced the sort of largest overall impact in terms of student number declines, absolute numbers, they'd seen a drop with students from China, so a proportional change of their total student cohort. China was the largest overall impact in terms of student numbers, around 1,400 less. Brazil, not too far behind, with 1,400 students less in New South Wales out of Brazil, and Colombia, just over 1,000 less numbers out of Brazil. And just noting again, this is only representing the student visa commencement data. Victoria, their decline was about 1,100 students dropping out of China, a little bit less out of Brazil, only 350 out of Brazil, but big impact out of Colombia with 1,300 students, and the largest cohort declining out of Victoria were actually the Colombian cohort. For Queensland, and again, just the almost 60% decline out of China, some 714 students. Almost equal declines out of Brazil and Colombia, so 940 students down out of Brazil and 993 students down out of Colombia, which in terms of market proportion, again, has seen why we've had that bigger declining number out of Queensland in the year-to-date position. And then just very, very quickly, for South Australia, China down 193, 75 out of Brazil. They'd had some bigger impact out of some of their other markets in terms of South Australia itself, but Colombia down 52, just focusing on those top 3 markets. And WA, we saw a decline of 200 students out of China, 200 students out of Colombia, and 186 out of Brazil. I think covering off the other markets, the numbers dropped down quite a lot, but happy to pick those up, or we certainly represent all of the state data in the monthly market report. Last, I just want to give a quick thanks to our partners from Allianz, who again have been our supporter across the market report series. I think I do just want to thank Allianz for their support. Moving on, we can just show that they've got some whole range of digital solutions which have been incredibly valuable across this last year and almost 2 years now, particularly with their apps and other information, online portal information. And if you'd like to contact any of those colleagues, then by all means, we have the contact details here available for you as well. Before we go, a special thanks once again to our partners from Department of Education, Skills and Employment and Bonnard. I saw a hand raised before for a question. I'm not sure whether we have the Q&A functionality set up here today, but by all means, please send an email through. You're most welcome to send it directly to me, Brett Blacker at englishaustralia.com.au, and we'll respond to any of those questions. Once again, just flagging, next week we will commence the data collection because we've just had to do a bit of catch up on Q1, but we'll be on track now to report Q2 in line with the Department of Education data. And a very, very special thanks to all of the participating providers that continue to provide their support and contribute to the surveys and enable us to present these insights to you. We'll distribute the report and a copy of the presentation to all of those providers, as well as the pivot table, which again you can utilise for your own analysis as well. So that concludes today's presentation. Thank you all for attending. Thanks again for all of the support for English Australia's initiative, and always happy to answer any questions or follow up after the session. Thank you very much and goodbye.